Um, Let me start by telling you how far out of my comfort zone I am. I am, as you have heard, a church historian. My home patch is the Protestant Reformation, the 16th, the 17th centuries. My research right now is on Protestant missionary projects and the slave trade, and that feels daringly modern to me. But I do have some interests in the longer history of Christianity in Western culture. And I have a persistent interest in the present day as well, partly because I live here. And what I want to do this afternoon is to suggest a way of thinking about our own times, about the age that we grew up in and are all living through, and the way that that age is changing into something else in front of our eyes. We have, at least I have, lived in a very secular age in which religion, as it's been normally understood, has been confined to certain well-defined roles and has struggled to find a voice beyond them. But that age, I will be arguing, has been based on a set of shared cultural assumptions and values that are unraveling. And everything is now up in the air again. And I should say that part of that unraveling is geographical. I am talking about a set of values that were formed in what we here still call the West. That is Western Europe and North America, the old imperial capitals of Christendom, the part of the world I call home. The unraveling of these values is connected to the decay of that region's cultural dominance. At least that's how it seems to me. In other words, the story I'm going to tell today is a very North Atlantic one. I'll be very interested to hear how the same issues look from a Brazilian perspective. Especially because, as well as offering a reading of recent history, I want to suggest what seems to me the essential way forward in this new world. A way forward that I think will depend on people who are able to have one foot in religious traditions and the other in the values of modern secularism. So, in 1947, the American radio network, ABC, began broadcasting a series with the modest title, The Greatest Story Ever Told. It ran for nearly 10 years. It was broadcast in over 50 countries. It produced a novel and eventually a movie. The title was an allusion to a poem called The Old, Old Story, which was written by an Englishwoman in 1866 and was set to music the following year and became a popular hymn. In neither case did the titles feel the need to clarify what this story was, because the story of Jesus Christ was still, up to the mid-20th century, the defining story in North American and Western European culture. It was a story that was told and retold, not because it was unfamiliar, but because it was so deeply familiar. Earnest Christian believers were a minority in Europe and North America in this period, but nominal adherents and assertive unbelievers still recognized the story's power. Atheists and skeptics of this era generally went out of their way to praise Jesus as an exceptional moral teacher. They may not have believed he was God incarnate, but he was their culture's most powerful moral figure. That atheist use of Jesus as a moral exemplar should tell you that from the point of view of traditional Christianity, this centrality of Jesus was at least a little double-edged. It was almost normal for the figure of Jesus to be contrasted with churches. The maneuver that was made most recently by the novelist Philip Pullman in his book, The Good Man Jesus and the Scoundrel Christ. This is a time-honored. So in one sense, Jesus was a stick who could be used to hit the churches. Even so, that meant that critics of the churches were playing on enemy territory. After all, using Jesus to critique the churches is what Christians have been doing for centuries. I think, incidentally, that this is why some campaigning atheists have been drawn repeatedly to the bizarre claim that Jesus never existed. This is a very implausible idea, and of course, completely unnecessary if all you're trying to do is argue the case for atheism. But if you are struggling to find a way around this figure's moral authority, it is a very attractive notion. One of the oddities about public discourse about religion in the from the early 19th to the mid 20th centuries is that both sides felt that they were losing. Christians saw themselves as being overwhelmed by rising secularism, but the anti-religious and secularists also felt in battle. And I think this is because while Christian practice was becoming a minority pursuit in Europe and North America in this period, Christianity continued to frame public discourse and values. In particular, it defined shared ethics. Providing a universal moral framework was almost its central purpose. It continued to do that for believers and unbelievers alike. That is why you retold the old story to yourself and to your children. Even if you no longer believed it as history or as doctrine, you believed its values. And so making a film of the greatest story ever told must have seemed like a good bet. But by the time it was finally released in 1965, that had changed. Its global box office receipts of $15 million only covered 3/4 of its huge production costs. It was critically panned, partly because of its 4-hour running time. It is now best remembered for John Wayne's comic cameo as the centurion at Calvary. Reverence was no longer the order of the day. And this is a microcosm of the cultural changes of the 1960s. I could refer here to the British student Christian movement, the SCM, which experienced the spiritual whiplash of that era in as extreme a form as any group on the planet. What had been a large mainstream Christian group in the 1940s and 50s underwent a near-death experience in the 1960s and 70s. It collapsed to less than 1/10 of its previous numbers as it wrestled with how to stay true to the values of the age, and in the process it lost hold of, or indeed deliberately renounced, its traditional Christian identity. And so it ended up being neither one thing nor the other. A Christian group that was too politically radical for most Christians and too Christian for most political radicals. I think it's a sort of accelerated microcosm of the whole story of modern secularization. So what brought Western societies to this tipping point in the 1960s, when European and North American societies began to see themselves as plural rather than Christian, when religion retreated from the public sphere at a new pace? Well, it is worth noting what did not cause this decisive shift to the secular. Christianity was not suppressed or persecuted. There have been plenty of attempts to confront Christianity directly in Europe and North America, from the French Revolution and the communist regimes to smaller scale campaigns by local atheist pressure groups. None of them have ever been very successful. If anything, the period since the 1950s is marked by the lack of substantial, coordinated anti-religious campaign. Nor does the post-1960s secular turn reflect any kind of contemporaneous collapse in the intellectual case for religion. Most modern atheists are happy to present themselves as heirs to the Enlightenment critique of religion, or the 19th century's debates about science. Not much of this is new, apart from a psychological and neurological dimension. If anything, the classic materialist argument against Christianity has weakened over the past century. 100 years ago, an educated layperson in Europe or North America might have been expected to believe that the universe is infinitely old and entirely deterministic, that the so-called races of humanity are fundamentally different from each other, that the process of evolution is governed by some kind of progressive life force. Such a person might also believe that the New Testament is a collection of myths created some centuries after the events it describes, and the Old Testament merely a collection of stories shared by peoples across the ancient Near East. All of those beliefs were the conventional wisdom of the early 20th century. All of them are, of course, inimical to, hostile to traditional Christianity, and none of them have stood the test of time. So, if Christianity has disintegrated intellectually, it happened a long time ago, not in the 1960s. So what did happen? Well, I suggest that Western Christianity did not face a political or an intellectual crisis. It faced a moral crisis. The moral authority of Christianity was already crumbling in the interwar period. But then came the decisive moral event of the modern age, the Second World War, the most terrible conflict in human history. The Allies, especially the United States, portrayed that war as a struggle for Christian civilization against an unspeakable anti-Christian evil. But while that wasn't exactly wrong, it was a bit of a stretch, not least when so much of the fighting and dying was being done by the atheist Soviet Union. Christianity's moral authority was fatally weakened by the Second World War. Not only because many churches and Christians were to some extent complicit with Nazism and fascism, or at least fatally indulgent towards them, but in the wider sense, the global crisis undermined Christianity's moral priorities. It now seemed plain that cruelty, discrimination, and murder were evil in a way that fornication or blasphemy or impiety were not. The struggle against a totalitarian regime that defined itself by racism and by dehumanizing its victims provided a moral template for the post-war age, a template that felt more powerful than the Christians and their old story. As the post-war generations digested these lessons, they turned the war into the Western world's foundation. Cultural conservatives in my country sometimes worry that modern Western societies lack shared narratives. But this is not really true. In the same way that Victorian publishers endlessly retold the life of Jesus, post-war films and novels and other media in Europe and America, and maybe especially in Britain, have endlessly retold and keep retelling the Second World War. And it is still happening. I don't believe that I have ever heard any one audio clip repeated as often as Neville Chamberlain's broadcast on the 3rd of September 1939, informing Britain that we were at war. Films, television, radio dramas, documentaries use that endlessly. And yet, though repetition should have dulled it, though I was born more than 30 years after Chamberlain died, it still turns my spine to water every time I hear it. My children, who were born in a different millennium, watch the newest cinematic retellings of the story of this war, transfixed, and they are hungry for more. In Britain, the phrases of Winston Churchill's speeches have sunk into our memories and grip us like words of scripture. You may have heard of Godwin's law. This is the principle that every argument on the internet eventually ends when someone calls someone else a Nazi. This is not an accident. It is because in our culture, that is the ultimate insult. The reason that it ends an argument is that it's a slap in the face. It puts an end to any further discussion. What more can you say? The struggle against Nazism is our final reference point. The Second World War retains an unparalleled grip on our imagination because it is our paradise lost, our Trojan War, our age's defining battle. Our modern creed, at least in the North Atlantic world, can be summed up by that great philosopher, Indiana Jones. Nazis, he said, I hate these guys. A century ago, the most potent moral figure in Western society was Jesus, but now it is Adolf Hitler. Perhaps we still believe that Jesus is good, but not with the same fervor and conviction that we believe Nazism is evil. Crosses, crucifixes have lost much of their power in our culture. You can play with them, you can joke about them, no one really minds. But there is no visual image which packs an emotional punch like a swastika. The contrarians and trolls and shock merchants of our day and age generally understand that this is a line they will not cross, or at least they did till recently. To put it another way, if you were to defend Stalin or to spread conspiracy theories about 9/11, about the September 11 attacks, then you will be seen as deluded. But if you deny the Holocaust, then you are a monster. And when you are ostracized, no one will defend you. And rightly so, because we know that in our cultural context, such a claim is never a naive mistake. It is always a deliberate attempt to justify the unjustifiable. Holocaust denial is our modern equivalent of blasphemy. Words that deny the deepest moral truth our society is built on. Words that we know are never spoken innocently. In other words, the reason Western society collectively relinquished its grip on Christianity since the 1960s is that we don't need it anymore. Its main function had been to provide a moral compass, and now we have a new one. If you read accounts of people in Europe who've turned from Christianity to humanism or materialism in the past generation or two, a recurrent point is that they came to feel that their Christian morals were in conflict with their post-Second World War morals, often over some specific issue like sexual ethics or control of their bodies. Or that they came to feel their moral convictions could stand by themselves and their Christian beliefs were redundant, could fall off and wither away. If there is a central idea to this new ethic, it is the idea of human rights. That's the foundation of our post-Second World War ethic. It was very deliberately formulated by legal philosophers to counteract an alternative idea that was popular after the First World War. That is the idea of group rights. That's the idea which underpins principles like national self-determination and ultimately militaristic exclusionary nationalism. It's in response to Nazism that we have the creation of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights in 1948, the European Convention on Human Rights in 1950, foreshadowed in the Atlantic Charter of 1941. But of course, the notion of human rights is much older than that. The United States Constitution has a Bill of Rights attached to it. That title, the Bill of Rights, looks back to an English document that was a century older. Now, those were legal rights asserted against specific authorities. But the French Revolution of 1789 produced a Declaration of the Rights of Man and the Citizen. And that also was informed by an earlier text, the work of the Francophile philosopher and slaveholder Thomas Jefferson. Jefferson was another of my moralizing skeptics. He was a deist, explicitly contrasted the moral teachings of Jesus to the corrupt doctrines of Christianity. This is what he famously wrote in the American Declaration of Independence in 1776. We hold these truths to be self-evident. That's an important phrase. That all men are created equal and endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights. You will notice that Jefferson does not try to argue that these rights exist, nor does he try to list them like his successors. He insists that these rights are self-evident, that they are obvious. Not coincidentally, this is exactly how generations of clergymen claimed that we know there is a God. And subsequent declarations of rights have done the same thing. The French Declaration simply asserts that the rights it describes are the natural, unalienable, and sacred, interesting word, rights of man. How do we know that human beings have rights? The answer is, we just know. So, this is obviously problematic. On one level, what Jefferson says is simply wrong. The existence of human rights is not self-evident, which is to say, a great many people in a great many historical settings have not believed that any such rights exist. The people whom Jefferson kept as slaves might have had something to say about it too. But this is a banal point. I think we all know that the modern doctrine of human rights is a castle in the air. It is a defiant, existential assertion of values without firm foundation. Now, if you are a philosopher, that may bother you. But, and this is what I think is important, most of us, most of the time, are not bothered about this. Because on a deeper level, for us at least, Jefferson is right. We really do find the existence of human rights and of human equality self-evident. The intellectual base for this doctrine may be weak, but it is intuitively true. It feels true. At least it does in our cultural context. If we try to articulate why that should be, and making the effort feels uncomfortable, we are questioning something that should not be questioned, maybe even committing a kind of blasphemy. If we try to articulate why we believe this, the kind of argument we come to is the one advanced by the UN Declaration in 1948, which begins by asserting that human rights are the foundation of freedom, justice, and peace in the world. That is a more pragmatic claim Jefferson made. And it then goes on to explain that disregard and contempt for human rights have resulted in barbarous acts which have outraged the conscience of mankind, and the advent of a world in which human beings shall enjoy freedom of speech and belief and freedom of fear from want has been proclaimed as the highest aspiration of the common people. So this is all about the Second World War. Of course it is. It was 1948. What do you expect? It is the experience of exceptionally barbarous acts and the claim that the common people have united around a declaration of 4 basic rights. That's what underpins the entire structure. And those rights are the 4 rights of Churchill and Roosevelt's Atlantic Charter. The assumption that the common people are identical to the victorious Allies is reflected in the way that the United Nations slides from being a term for the military alliance against the Axis powers to being the name for the post-war international organization which the victorious Allies founded. Now, to begin with, in the 1950s, the war was mostly remembered in nationalistic and heroic terms. But as the post-war generations began to grow up, as it became possible to look directly at the deeper wounds the war had inflicted, the mood began to shift. This is not only because events like the Adolf Eichmann trial in 1961 and the Spiegel affair in West Germany in 1962 forced a reckoning with the memory of the war. The Sharpeville massacre in South Africa in 1960 and the contemporaneous civil rights movement in the United States showed that evils which at least resonated with Nazi racial ideology were still destroying lives a decade and a half after Hitler's suicide. So the war had been won, but it was not over. And the real proof of the power of this story, of how central it has become to our sense of ourselves, is how we have turned it from history into myth and have transposed it into timelessness. It started while the war was still going on. But to many people, it is incongruous, even embarrassing, that the best-selling work of fiction of the 20th century is a very long, unapologetically archaic, and sometimes self-indulgent fairy tale, written by a philologist who was a very traditional Roman Catholic and whose most devoted readers were and still are teenage boys. But even if you share the disdain for Tolkien's The Lord of the Rings, I don't think you can argue with its cultural importance. Tolkien had no patience for allegory as a literary form. He vigorously denied that that's what he had written. But if his War of the Ring does not mirror the Second World War that was raging while he wrote the book, it certainly refracts it. And he admitted as much in private. Tolkien was an early and a staunch opponent of Nazism, but he was also a veteran of the Battle of the Somme from the First World War. He knew that this war was, like any war, an ultimately evil job. This is what he told his son in 1944. And he used the language of his own developing myth to explain what he meant. Not only that there were a great many orcs on our side, but that we are attempting to conquer Sauron with the ring. Such a war might end in victory, but a victory whose effect would be to breed new Saurons. Only his mythical could be won with moral purity. But if we're using the war's memory to set our moral compasses, then it's mythical, clear-cut versions of it that we need. That's what Tolkien gave us, and we have been breeding new Saurons ever since. The figure of the Dark Lord has stalked through the most persistent and popular mythologies of the post-war era, from Star Wars' Darth Vader to Harry Potter's Lord Voldemort. The debt that these Hitlers owe to their real-world archetype is sometimes implied, sometimes acknowledged, but it's always obvious. These are the myths on which generations of children in the post-Christian West have been raised, transposing, cleansing the brutal lessons of the Second World War into timeless morality tales. It's a lesson our culture seems determined to teach itself and eager to learn and relearn, that this is what true evil looks like, even though in reality evil rarely appears so unambiguously. This transposition has all kinds of advantages. It allows the myth to evolve, to purify itself, even to eat itself. You can condemn the imperialism of Winston Churchill, the racial politics of Tolkien, even the supposed transphobia of J.K. Rowling, all the while taking your bearings from the moral universe that they've created for you. But self-cannibalism is not usually a good sign. I think there are reasons to suspect that our post-war value system is running into problems. So this is how I think we got to where we are, with Christianity supplanted by a set of secular values that are much more experiential, intuitive, and mythic, and much less universal, rational, and self-evident than they claim. The fact that those values feel self-evident to us, as indeed they do to me, is not a solution. It is part of the problem. The rest of what I want to say falls into the two halves promised by my time. First, why I think the values of this secular age, the value system that's more fragile than it feels, needs what Christianity can give it. And secondly, why Christianity needs those fragile values in return. Of course, just because I think something needs to happen is not to say that it will. There are reasons to be pessimistic, but I promise to offer you at least a sliver of hope before we finish. Why do I say this secular value system is in trouble? Given how much it's based on a particular event, it's not surprising that its grip on our imagination should falter as it falls off the edge of living memory. The stories remain compelling, but they become unreal when we no longer have parents or grandparents who can say to us, yes, I remember. Of course, Christians whose faith is based on a much further off historical event are well aware that pivotal events can become timeless. But the transition is tricky. And for all that it is mythologized as the good war, the Second World War's morality is messier than we might like. Hiroshima, Dresden, Yalta, the Bengal famine. And if even people like me, a white middle-class British man, are starting to see the story a little less like a pivotal cosmic moment and a little more like just another war, how much more does that apply to people whose background gives them a different perspective on a so-called world war fought between colonial powers? I admit I know very little of how the Second World War was seen in your part of the world, which was not directly caught up in it. In my own country, it's increasingly clear that one of the purposes that Britain's valorization of the Second World War has served is to act as a kind of historical virtue shield between ourselves and the uglier parts of British imperialism. So we can say to ourselves, yes, there were famines in India, but we stood alone against the Nazis, and so we still come out ahead. In fact, all that maneuver seems to have done is to delay Britain's post-imperial reckoning, a process which is now in full spate. In Britain, over the last few years, the moral centrality of the Nazi era in our collective historical imagination has been seriously challenged by the recollection of the slave trade. And perhaps it's the moral lessons learned from Nazism that are used to critique the slave trade, but if so, that's what makes this much more powerful. Not that I think the slave trade and its abolition will become a new unifying national myth. Instead, I think its new salience indicates a breakdown of that shared focus on a single key moral moment. Instead, people gravitate towards the histories which teach the moral lessons that they want to hear. And there are some conceptual problems too. The most obvious is that by basing our value system around Hitler rather than Jesus, we have replaced a positive exemplar with a negative. We know what we hate, we do not know what we love. Insofar as we have positive values, they are deliberately vacant categories like liberty, whose nature is that they're undefined. In the age of Hannah Arendt, our culture has developed quite a deep understanding of evil, but an impoverished understanding of what philosophers call the good. It would be routine here for me to grouch about consumerism. But the desire for wealth and physical prosperity is a universal feature of human societies. These things have a perfectly legitimate place. The trouble is that in modernity, we lack much sense of what else to desire. Apart from anything, this lends itself to a wretchedly defensive public in which the best we seem to be able to hope for is to resist various bad developments because we know what we hate, rather than look for anything genuinely hopeful. In other words, we say that the world is as good as it gets. And it turns out that for many of us, that's not quite good enough. And so our moral energies focus on opposition and denunciation. And our public discourse becomes ever more shrill. One of George Orwell's less remembered but more queasily accurate prophecies in 1984 is the regular ritual of the 2-minute hate. Of course, he got the detail wrong. He meant the 140 character hate. As well as being tedious, this is also self-cannibalizing. As we say in English, haters are going to hate. And since we are all haters now, we have to keep searching for new prey. The peculiar characteristic of revolutionary hatred is the purity style, in which distinctions are drawn and virtue is signaled by turning on previously accepted or admired or neutral figures. The incentive is always to strike first before the same process is applied to you. Typically, this happens when a new orthodoxy suddenly hardens and then its application is applied retrospectively. Trans issues have become the arena par excellence for this in the last few years, but there are others. One phrase I keep being struck in debates over these issues is the phrase, you'll find it all over Twitter, "My human rights are not up for debate." You will often see this being used by LGBTQ advocates, but not exclusively by them. I think this is a really interesting turn of phrase, which can be read at 3 different levels. In the first, it is self-evidently correct. In the second, it is self-evidently nonsense. And in the third, it has a deeper truth to it. So it is obviously correct that it is insulting or worse for some people, typically meaning straight, white, middle-class, cisgender men such as myself, to debate whether people who are different from them share in their own rights, and to expect those people to participate. Because to do that is to sit in a place of security, asking other people to discuss dispassionately whether they should have the same privileges. But the same gambit, my human rights are not up for debate, is also obviously wrong. Because plainly all of our human rights are and must be up for debate. We disagree with each other about what human rights are. The various declarations and bills of rights vary a good deal. Even if we could agree on a basic list, rights conflict with each other, and those conflicts have to be resolved. There is a reason human rights law is a complex and contested area. Human rights must be debated because the only alternatives to debate are to fight about it, or simply to submit to one person's view. But at a deeper level still, the claim that human rights are not up for debate takes us back to Jefferson's claim that human rights are self-evident. At the most fundamental, the subject can't be debated because there's no basis on which to do so. Rights are asserted, and either you agree with the assertion or you don't. Actual debate, that is, constructive, good faith discussion between people of different viewpoints who are honestly pursuing agreement, that is very difficult in this area. It's increasingly hard to find shared ground on which debates can be held. It therefore easily turns into mutual mockery or willful and malicious misunderstanding. This isn't necessarily anybody's fault. I imagine many of us have found ourselves caught in conversations like this. It's just inevitable. It's where our increasingly brittle system of values is taking us. You'll notice that part of the brittleness of this system, one of the problems built into a value system defined by evil rather than by goodness, is its lack of space for forgiveness and for redemption. Those concepts are indeed often seen as suspect, and fair enough, they are often tools used by the powerful to create impunity, demanding forgiveness from those who instead deserve justice. Christians have, of course, been deeply implicated in this abuse of the notion of forgiveness and should not accept absolution for that sin too quickly and easily. But the problem remains. The moral lessons that we have learnt from the Nazi era do not have much to say about forgiveness. The great political lesson learned from the Second World War was about appeasement. And the horror of appeasement led directly to the Suez fiasco in 1956. It left John F. Kennedy with terrifyingly little room for maneuver during the Cuban Missile Crisis, and it's implicated in our more recent wars as well. In law, we find it increasingly hard to cope with amnesties or other acts of indulgence or oblivion. The great exception to this rule in modern times, South Africa's Truth and Reconciliation Committee, was also openly influenced by Christian moral theology to an extent that's unusual in modern times. And I think that is why the many attempts to copy its formula in other contexts have usually failed. Ethics aside, I would suggest that merely as a matter of social and political pragmatism, some capacity for forgiveness is essential, especially in an age when the bottomless memory of social media means that forgetting, the traditional alternative to forgiving, is becoming increasingly difficult. Otherwise, we all end up throwing stones at one another's glass houses. Or, more likely, the powerful will manipulate this dynamic to give themselves new kinds of impunity, while wielding our unforgiving public morality to destroy whomsoever they choose. And even the central moral insight of our anti-Nazi value system, its focus on human evil, has its problems. Now, because I'm British, this calls to mind a famous comedy sketch in which two comedians play two SS officers chatting to each other. And one of them begins to be troubled by the fact that he has skulls on his uniform, begins to wonder what this might mean. Why, he asks his comrade, are these symbols so much more sinister than those of the Allies? And eventually he asks his comrade, do you think we are the baddies, the villains? And of course, what makes this work as a comic sketch is that while to us it seems self-evident that the Nazis were the villains, to them it didn't. If German soldiers were unsettled by skulls on their uniforms, it did not lead them to desert their posts. Most Nazis did not think of themselves as evil. Perhaps none did. Real-life villains do not tend to cackle diabolically. Our modern, mythologized versions of the Nazis, our procession of dark lords, are a farcically unrealistic depiction of what real evil looks like. Most villains don't wear skulls on their uniforms. They are slyer and subtler than that. They are often rooted inside us. We can't defeat them by jumping into a Spitfire and blowing things up. And our anti-Nazi values do not give us much wisdom on how to tackle such evils. You'll often see the term pure evil being wielded as an insult in our value system. But in traditional Western Christian ethics, that phrase makes no sense. Evil is by definition impure. It is a negation, a corruption, or a distortion of something that is or was once good. And that means it can be both forgiven and overcome. But it also recognizes its ubiquity and its many faces. Like Tolstoy's Unhappy Families, the varieties of evil are endless. Yes, racism, militarism, patriarchy, authoritarianism, genocide, these things are evil, but they are not the only evils. Knowing that we are against them will not do much to help us stop, say, the climate crisis or the entrenchment of inequality in our societies, or indeed a pandemic. It was bleakly funny in 2020 to see how some Western countries tried to understand the sudden crisis through the prism of the Second World War. But viruses are not Nazis. This is not an enemy whose morale we can break or who is trying to break ours. We have been, as we say, fighting the last war. The liveliness of our wartime rhetoric was not matched by the effectiveness of our public health work. I'm speaking to you from the country with one of the worst COVID death tolls in Europe, although I'm aware that it has nothing to what Brazil has endured. I also think it's significant that our imaginations have latched gratefully onto the possibility that the pandemic began with a leak from a Chinese lab, which would mean a human villain behind it. This isn't really to do with our Nazi obsession, but the desire to find scapegoats for epidemics is an ancient one. But still, it seems likelier that this was a natural event. This underlines what may become the decisive weakness of our anti-Nazi value system, that it has nothing to say directly to environmental issues. Indeed, by giving such a central role to human rights, it builds in an unhelpfully rigid distinction between the human and the non-human realms. It seems likely that the major collective changes we will face in this century will be triggered by environmental degradation more than genocidal tyrannies. We'd better have a value system that helps us to deal with both. So for all these reasons, I think both that our current secular value system is breaking down and that we will need to draw on the resources of religious value systems, which are deep-rooted and ethically more supple and sophisticated, in order to prepare and replace it. But there is another side to this question. You will have noticed that the worldwide Christian response to the emerging crisis of confidence in our secular values has on the whole not been constructive and sympathetic. Instead, it's been characterized by smelling secularists' blood in the water. Many of the most open political challenges to our post-Nazi ethical consensus, I'm thinking of politicians such as Donald Trump in the United States, or Viktor Orban in Hungary, or indeed your very own President Bolsonaro. Such men have characterized their brands of cultural conservatism as Christian and have won considerable support from evangelical constituencies in the process. I do find myself reminded of the Nazi Party's claim in its founding program in 1920 that it stands for a positive Christianity. I do not mean that these gentlemen are Nazis, obviously not. But they are making the same maneuver. They are using Christianity as an identity, as a means of telegraphing their social position to their potential supporters. For the Nazis, Christian was a code for anti-Jewish and anti-communist. Nowadays, it is code for anti-Islamic, anti-academic, anti-globalist, anti-elitist. It is not really a value system at all. This is Christianity as a tribe, not as a movement. It may be loosely connected to the rejection of certain parts of secular value systems, LGBTQ issues most obviously. But even this doesn't run very deep. These modern cultural Christian movements, let's say they are not marked by their ostentatious commitment to traditional Christian sexual ethics. Now, I need to be careful how I comment on this phenomenon. Personally, I find most of the features of this assertive cultural Christianity pretty unpleasant. And since I also claim a Christian identity for myself, embarrassing. But I want to put that to one side and look at it in a more hard-headed way. And to argue that for all the surge of energy behind it, this is a movement with no future. It is too obviously a reaction to, a mirror image of our modern secular values. And while it certainly derives some of its power from the weaknesses of those values, their shallow roots, their brittle stridency, it doesn't solve their problems. Quite the opposite, in fact. It gives our secular value systems exactly the kinds of opponents they crave. When I said earlier that most real-world villains are subtler and more ambiguous than these caricatures, certainly for a North Atlantic audience, the obvious figure who comes to mind is this one. Mr. Trump may have been Voldemort in a clown suit, but in a world where Voldemorts of any kind are thin on the ground, you take what you can get. We may not know how to deal with climate change, with pandemics, with economic injustice, but at least we think we know how to deal with him. The gambit which these political movements are making is to attack our modern secular value system, the anti-Nazi system, but without putting anything in its place. The rhetoric is of a reversion to Christian values, to Christendom values, we might say. But all that seems to mean in practice is making some attempts to unlearn the moral lessons of the 20th century. In the short term, as we all know, the resulting vacuum of values fills itself with corruption and conspiracy. In the medium term, that's not going to be sustainable. It will fill itself with something else. Whether that something involves learning from the values of the secular world or embedding itself against them, that is going to be the decisive question. I think embedding against them would be wrong, but worse than that, I think it would be foolish and that it will fail. If there is one thing that the stories of these politicians has taught us, it is that this is exactly the kind of opposition the secular world craves. It wants Christians who will follow this script, who will caricature themselves, who will let themselves to be defined by cruelty, thuggishness, and stupidity, and who will, in the end, be publicly proven wrong. The moral lessons of the 20th century, the lessons that discrimination and cruelty and murder are worse than sexual or doctrinal errors. These are not trivial ideas, and they were not easily learned. The same could be said of the great moral lessons of the 19th century, such as the lesson that slavery is always wrong. A Christianity that has a future is one that embraces these lessons. Doesn't do so grouchily or hesitantly, but does it wholeheartedly. And then asks what else it can bring to add some colour to a secular value system which only seems to be able to debate which issues should be seen in black and white and which ones in shades of grey. A Christianity which provides something to love in addition to all the things that we know we ought to hate. Can it be done? Well, I think so. I see considerable hope in Pentecostalism. That is, in Pentecostalism at its best, a phenomenon which offers genuinely uplifting and enriching spirituality. Not the Pentecostalism which plays politics, but the one which follows the original Pentecostal insight that the political sphere, however important it is, will never provide us with salvation. We are most human, and we come closest in this world to finding whatever it is we desire in communities, in families, and as individuals, not as mass collectives. And so Pentecostalism's politics, if it has any, are the politics of liberty and of equality before God. Now, if Pentecostalism isn't to your taste, fair, I'm not a Pentecostal myself, fair enough. But a Christian movement that has for more than a century been led by and spread amongst the world's poorest and most persecuted people, and which now counts over 500 million followers, has earned the right to be heard. And anyway, whether or not the kind of synthesis I'm talking about can be done, it must be. We will not be able to manage the challenges of this century without all the resources of our old values, the ones that tell us what is good, as well as our new ones that tell us what is evil. How can that be done? Well, the most obvious obstacle maybe contains the germ of a solution within it. Christianity, in many of our cultures, has a very real problem of moral authority, for the excellent reason that it has been profoundly implicated in abusive and exploitative structures of power for many centuries. It may simply be that we in our generation need to accept that we are still a long way from having earned the right to be heard, that Christians need to go deeper into the wilderness and spend longer there first, maybe another century or two. Be that as it may, what is needed is repentance and humility, the very opposite of assertive claims to authority or of moral denunciation. Those are the only means by which Christians have in the past ever truly attained moral authority. It also just so happens that those particular moral qualities, repentance and humility, are the ones which both our secular value system and its cultural Christian critics so obviously and damagingly lack. These truly are something that a progressive Christianity, let's say an authentic, can bring to the table. Those of us for whom Jesus Christ is still the moral lodestar could do worse than go back to the first word that the first book of the New Testament to be written records him as preaching. Repent. Thank you very much for your attention. I'm sorry that went on slightly longer than I was expecting.